Dear students, welcome to the 21st session, which is on the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens, prescribed by the Mangalore University for 3rd semester BA Optional English, Paper 3, Victorian Literature. This is Vasanta Ravi Prakash, Associate Professor, Department of English, Punapradna College, Udupi. This video highlights chapters 13 to 21. In the previous session, you have seen that Tubman loves Rachel and Mr. Jingle diverts Rachel's interest towards him. Mr. Jingle elopes with Rachel. You have learnt Mr. Pickwick's role in rescuing Rachel from Jingle. Dickens introduces Sam Weller as Mr. Pickwick's servant. The Pickwickians, led by Mr. Pickwick, move to Eatansville, where they witness an election. As per the plan, the Pickwickians visit the town of Eatansville. The Pickwickians get to know the election is between a blue candidate called Samuel Slumkey and a buff candidate called Horatio Fiskin. Dickens vividly picturizes the noisy election atmosphere present there. Pickwick and his friends decide to support Mr. Samuel Slumkey as Mr. Pickwick's lawyer, Mr. Perker, supports him. Mr. Perker introduces Pickwick and Winkle to Mr. Pott. Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Winkle accept Mr. Pott's invitation and stay in his house. While Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Pott are busy in the election events, Mr. Winkle and Mrs. Pott stay at home as Mrs. Pott is not keen in politics. Mr. Winkle entertains Mrs. Pott and gives her good company. The closeness between Mr. Winkle and Mrs. Pott leads to complication in later stage. In this part, Dickens portrays very clearly the commotion and noise of an election time. As usual, election gimmicks such as dumping the electors somewhere in order to avoid them voting, bribing the electors, so on and so forth take place. The election result comes favorable to the blue candidate Samuel Slumkey. Meanwhile, Snodgrass and Tubman reside in an inn called Peacock. Dickens introduces one more story in this context. A bagman who meets Snodgrass and Tubman narrates the story of a salesman called Tom Smart. Tom Smart wishes to marry a widow who runs an inn. Tom Smart understands that the widow is interested to marry another man who had black beard. The widow's richness was a center of attraction for Tom to decide to marry her. Very mysteriously, a chair in the room where Tom Smart lives speaks to him. The chair gives Tom a clue to find out a letter which was an evidence to prove that the bearded man was already married to someone else. Tom Smart shows the letter to the widow, which makes her understand the truth, and she agrees to marry Tom Smart. Dickens highlights the greed of Tom Smart and his perseverance and effort to marry the widow. The predatory nature of a widow is one of the factors which Dickens likes to highlight in this novel. Later, Mr. Pickwick becomes a victim of the predatory nature of a widow called Mrs. Bardell. In another episode, Mrs. Leo Hunter arranges a costume party. Mrs. Leo represents a snobbish Victorian woman. The purpose of hosting a costume party is to show off that she has acquaintance with people who have achieved remarkable things in their life. Mr. Pickwick's club and his mission to explore human life by traveling make Mr. Pickwick a popular personality. In Mrs. Leo Hunter's views, Mr. Pickwick is an achiever. An example to say that Mrs. Leo is a humbug is a poem written by her. The title of the poem is Ode to an Expiring Frog. The very title of the poem suggests that it is farce and has no serious or noteworthy content in it. Mr. Pickwick agrees to attend the party, but he makes it clear that he would not come in any costume, and Mr. Leo Hunter accepts it. This reveals the simplicity of Mr. Pickwick. Meanwhile, Tupman announces his idea to attend the costume party in the costume of a bandit. Mr. Tupman's idea of wearing the costume of a bandit displeases Mr. Pickwick. A small tussle takes place between Mr. Pickwick and Tupman, but they reconcile very soon. Through the interference of Mr. Pickwick in Mr. Tupman's choice of a costume, Dickens shows Mr. Pickwick as a mentor and as a guide. The costume chosen by a person reveals his personality. Snodgrass chooses Troubadour's costume even though he is incompetent to write a verse. Winkle dresses as a sportsman. Mrs. Leo graces the party in the costume of Minerva, and Mrs. Spot goes in the costume of Apollo. Mr. Jingle elegantly appears as Mr. Charles Fitzmarshall, but when he sees Mr. Pickwick, he quickly escapes from the place. This episode mainly focuses on the snobbery of women of Victorian age. Mrs. Spot is a mirror of dandyism, hypocrisy, and snobbishness, which are the prime features of women of Victorian era. Mr. Jingle's guilt and vindictive nature are also exposed in this episode. From the humbug Yatsonville Society, Dickens moves to incidents which expose the loyalty and sincerity of Sam Weller towards his master, Mr. Pickwick. Dickens creates another situation where Mr. Pickwick once again becomes the victim of situation. Mr. Jingle and his servant Job Trotter create a plot against Mr. Pickwick. Sam Weller meets Job Trotter and Job Trotter misleads Sam thoroughly. Job Trotter tells that Jingle has planned to elope with a rich heiress who is still in board school. As expected, Pickwick decides to stop this elopement, not knowing that it is hoax created by Job Trotter. Job Trotter asks Mr. Pickwick to enter the board school by jumping over the compound wall of the school. Pickwick accepts to do this hesitantly. The goodwill of Pickwick forces him to do things against his convictions. Dickens exposes Mr. Pickwick's concern for the safety and welfare of women. The elopement does not take place as expected by Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick is pushed into an embarrassing situation as the board school inmates suspect him to be either a criminal or a madman, as he was found in a suspicious manner inside the school campus. This incident strengthens the bonding between Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller. Sam Weller takes the help of Mr. Waddle and Mr. Trundle and comes to the spot to rescue Mr. Pickwick from the situation. Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller share the humiliation of the practical joke played by Jock Trotter. The entry of Mr. Waddle and his would-be son-in-law Trundle strengthens the moral support which Pickwick gets from Sam Weller. The various experiences which Mr. Pickwick gets in this journey molds his character to great extent. Dear students, here we come to the end of the session 21. Thank you.